This academic writing lecture is about cohesion and information flow. Here's a text from Academic English Online, which expresses how important it is for academic writers to be able to write cohesively. That means they write in a way that creates clear and logical relationships between ideas. We will be looking at different grammatical and lexical ways of achieving this in this lecture. Here are the different ways of achieving cohesion and information flow that we're going to look at. We'll start with reference. In this slide, the writer uses the word he, which is highlighted in red, along with him. Repeatedly, this is used to refer back to the name Hermann Ebbinghaus. This is a simple example of creating cohesion within a text. Here's another example. In the first text, number 1, the writer uses "in doing so," which is highlighted in red. Again, so refers back to something that was described before. It's a substitute for came up with the revolutionary idea. Instead of having to repeat all of that information, the writer can use substitution. Actually, the second example is an example of the same strategy where all is a substitution for 74 species of African antelope. The third example is slightly different. The words in red, another part and the remainder, refer back not exactly to the water. The water isn't mentioned again. There's an ellipsis. So this is substitution by zero. By referring to part, simply just to a part or the remainder, the writer refers us back to the water. It's not necessary to say another part of the water or the remainder of the water. Another way of creating cohesion between your ideas is to use sentence connectors. Examples are therefore or furthermore. And what I'm going to do is to show you different examples. These examples are grouped according to the function. Sometimes they're used for addition, sometimes for contrast, for example, to emphasize information, or to introduce an effect or a result. However, these words are not always interchangeable, and these are not the only way of connecting ideas. Now, these two texts contain similar information, but the information is presented in a different way. I'm going to give you some time to read these texts. I want you to decide which do you think is the most cohesive. I find text A easier to follow. Although in text B, sentence connectors are used, they're not always used appropriately. The writer uses firstly, secondly, they use so, but other ways of making texts cohesive don't actually need sentence connectors. In text A, much of the cohesion comes from the use of the word this. This is normally achieved armed with this information, and this is known as the marketing mix. This is enough to guide the reader of the text in a very effective way. The writer of text A also uses vocabulary effectively to achieve cohesion. This is called lexical cohesion, and we're going to look at some examples of this now. Perhaps the most simple way of achieving lexical cohesion is through repetition. You can do this simply, as in the first example here, where the same word, patient, is repeated. Or you can use more complex repetition. The second text here uses debt, debts, and debtor, words all belonging to the same family, to cause the text to be linked together. Now, very simple repetition can result in a slightly boring experience for your reader. So it's advisable to think carefully about using more complex repetition if you can, or indeed to use synonyms. Let me show you some examples. On the left, you've got some nouns and a synonym for each noun. On the right, you've got some verbs and a synonym for each verb. By using a synonym, you can avoid repetition of exactly the same word. However, one area to be really conscious of is that a synonym is very rarely an exact match in meaning. And in your academic field, it's very important that you're precise in meaning. So if I can make that clear by looking at some examples, if these words have some synonyms, or what do you think they might be? Let me make some suggestions. Is globalization the same as internationalization? Is a theory the same as a hypothesis? Dolly the sheep was a clone, but was she a copy? Was she a twin? The important thing to note is that these synonyms haven't not got exactly the same meaning as the original word, so you may be forced in some cases to repeat a word. But remember that you can vary the form of that word. We saw an example of that with debt, debts, and debtor. Instead of economy, we might use economic or economist, for example. I'm going to show you a text that contains a lot of lexical cohesion. Here it is. We looked at this text earlier, but this time we've coloured words which are repeated, or where a synonym replaces the original word. You'll see that there are lots of examples of repetition and synonym use. Mitigation is repeated through mitigate and mitigation. Climate change is repeated in green. Instead of collective action in blue, we have community and cooperation. And instead of knowledge spillovers in grey, which is near the end of the text, we then have diffusion and transfer of knowledge, a synonym for that phrase. And this is a way of continuing to talk about a subject and helping the reader to follow you. It's either through repetition or through use of synonyms. Let's move on to look at another strategy within lexical cohesion. These three examples show us the use of shell nouns. Here are three examples. The first example uses a verb phrase to describe economic theory. Economic theory ascribes the primary role in the provision of public goods to government. And it continues with a shell noun. This emphasis, the words in red, are a substitute for all of the information in the previous sentence. They're like a shell that contains all of that information. This emphasis on government. So the writer's continuing to talk about the same idea, using the idea from the previous sentence in the next one. The second example contains two sentences. It begins with the results of some scientific research, and then it continues with the shell noun, these findings, which refers back to all of the information in the previous sentence. The third example, another example of how to use a shell noun, contains two sentences, and the first one presents statistical information. The writer continues with the shell noun, this estimate. Just a couple of words that encapsulate all of the information from earlier in the text. Now, these are just a few examples of shell nouns, so let me show you some more that are commonly used in academic writing. In your writing, you can begin sentences or refer back to earlier ideas by saying, this account, or this advice, or such an answer, or an argument like this, etc. There are many ways that you can nominalize or use nouns to represent information that you've presented earlier. It's also a really good idea to try and notice the use of these nouns in your reading and not just use them in your writing. One of the best ways of improving your academic writing is to pay really close attention to how articles in your discipline are written. How do writers from your discipline connect ideas together and create cohesive texts? The last point we're going to look at today is information flow. This strongly influences how a writer orders information. And it has a big impact on the readability and the clarity of a text. So I want you to compare these two versions of a text. Both of them have the same content, but the information's been ordered differently. Which one do you find easier to read and why? I find the second text easier to follow, and this is because of information flow, the way that the information is organized. Let's look at some examples of how that works. Now, it's customary in English writing for sentences to start with a piece of information and add new information. We call the starting point the theme. And the new, or the additional information, is called the rime. In this example, the rime, or the extra, the new information in one sentence becomes the theme, or the starting point of the next sentence. I'll read the first one as an example. The complete electrical behavior of any valve or transistor can be described by stating the interrelation of the currents and the voltages between all the electrodes. Now, this sentence starts by talking about electrical behavior, that's the theme, and it adds information about the interrelation, or the relationships, of the currents and the voltages. If you look at the diagram at the bottom of the slide, you can see that the starting point behavior gives way to interrelation. This new information becomes the starting point for the next sentence. Let's look at the next sentence. These relationships can conveniently be displayed graphically, and the various curves are known as the characteristics of the device. Here's the new information in sentence number 2. Characteristics, the rime of the second sentence, will become the theme of the third sentence. In principle, all the characteristics should be available to the designer, etc. And you can see this in the diagram at the bottom of the slide, where characteristics then becomes the starting point for the third sentence. This kind of information flow helps the reader to follow the information that you're presenting. That's just one way to organize the information in your text. Here's another way. Again, sentences contain given or starting information, the theme. But here, the theme of the first sentence, anthropology, which I'm going to highlight, anthropology, is the theme also of the second sentence. It is the study of how our species evolved. It's also the theme of the next part of the second sentence. It is also the study of how our species developed. And it's the theme, or the starting point, of the next two sentences. It is the study of how culture evolved, and finally, it is the study of how culture, people, and nature interact. So the diagram at the bottom tries to represent the structure. All of the sentences start with the same theme. It's another way of organizing the flow of information in your writing. To see this in practice, we'll look at one of the slides from earlier in this lecture, the slide about Hermann Ebbinghaus. Hopefully, you're able to recognize which of the models we're looking at. The theme of each of the sentences is, which I'm going to highlight, is the same. It's Hermann Ebbinghaus, with, in each case, new information about that person. He argued that philosophers had come up with, etc. He aimed to collect objective experimental evidence. But it's not the case that you have to choose one model or the other. Let me show you something which is probably more common. And that's a combination of the two models. In this paragraph, the theme is highlighted in yellow, and the rime of each sentence is highlighted in blue. You can see that the rime is used to start a new sentence 3 times, whereas the theme of one sentence is repeated in the next sentence 4 times. So this gives a certain rhythm to the overall paragraph. Okay, let's look at the main points over again. We've looked at reference, substitution, and ellipsis as means of creating cohesion. We've looked at sentence connectors, but remember that these are not the only way of creating cohesion within a text. Other ways include lexical cohesion, such as repetition. Remember that simple repetition can be a little boring to read, so work on developing more complex patterns. Synonyms are one way of doing this. Remember that it's very important to be conscious of the meaning, whether there is any difference in meaning, and that some keywords may not have close enough synonyms, and you may have to use those words repetitively. Shell nouns, with this or these plus a noun, are very useful devices. And finally, we've looked at information flow. It's generally good to avoid starting sentences with completely new information in order to create cohesion.